There are two levels of evaluation that are needed when doing research. First, you are evaluating the results of a search to determine which of the list are worth more of your time. Most of us wish for a results list that is 100% accurate and usable, but that rarely happens. So we'll start out looking at our results list from our PubMed search. The first thing I typically look at is the title of the article. It is tempting to stop there at times, but most of the time it is worth going one step farther. The first article is one of these. If I click on the title, I get more information about the article, including the abstract, a one-paragraph summary of the important points of the article. I can see why I got the article, as it does deal with college students and diet, and it might actually be an interesting side note to my paper, but the abstract makes it clear that the topic studied is only peripherally related to my topic. In this case, the title would have been enough, but titles can be deceptive. The second article looks a little more relevant. If I look at the abstract, I think this could easily fit into my paper, even if it does not necessarily deal with college food services or with the United States. It also gives me another direction I might want to go with my paper. Perhaps instead of focusing on college dining services, I might look at food avoidance. This is another example of how research works. You start researching one thing, and as you find information, your topic can change direction a bit. Once I find an article that I think fits, I'll look beyond the abstract at the keywords and, in this database, mesh terms. In this article, the keyword that might be relevant is food avoidance, and mesh terms that might be of interest are avoidance learning and feeding behavior. Skipping down to Article 5, just for time considerations, this one looks really promising in terms of the title. Reading the article, this could be a key point in my paper. I see the mesh term dietary fats, which would be a great way to search, rather than just the word fats. The next form of evaluation we need to do is the information itself. Today, we hear a lot about fake news, but fake news is not new, and it is not exclusive to the news. Fake news has been found in scholarly research throughout history. This means that we need to read our research with some skepticism. In other words, read critically. Let's look at article number 5 from our search. This article happens to be available from these links in the top right corner. One of the how-to guides linked on the first page of the HNS guide is for information evaluation. There are various ways to look at evaluating information, but basically there are several criteria to examine while you read the article. First is, who are the authors? Do you know anything about them? In scholarly articles, you usually know a bit, like where they teach or work, and often how to contact them. Second, how current is the information? The answer to this is different for different fields. Health fields often like to use the 5-year rule of thumb, but there was a medical study done at an Ivy League medical college that only looked at 50 years of research. 50 years seems reasonable at first glance, but it turned out, after several study participants died, that a very similar study had been done before their research period, and if they had gone a few more years back, they would have known that the drug they were testing had known fatalities. Don't be afraid to go back in time, but do make sure that you have the most recent information included, and most of your sources are recent. Third is relevancy. This too is subjective and depends on your specific need. If you are working on your thesis, a lot of information is going to be relevant, even if it is not exactly what you are doing. On the other hand, if you are writing a 5-page paper, you are likely to not need the same amount of depth. In fact, it is quite easy to get too much information for a 5-page paper. In that case, Relevant information probably does only deal with the specific issue you are writing on. Fourth is the obvious accuracy criteria. If you find obvious errors in a source, it is probably not one that you want to use. On the other hand, not everybody believed the sun was the center of the solar system, and Galileo was arrested for his weird ideas. Just because there are two schools of thought does not mean that the less common one is wrong. You can only report on the evidence given in the literature until you do your own research. If there is disagreement in research results, you might have to really examine the research methods of the various researchers to determine whose research is likely to be the best. Finally, look at the purpose of the research article. Most of what you find using our more professional databases, like PubMed or Physical Education Index, will be research with the intent to inform. But most of what is published in magazines and on the web is intended to persuade you to a particular way of thought. In fact, in research, you can also find some elements of persuasion. What is important is that you recognize biases. To use another medical example, until the last few decades, most medical research was done on white men, with no recognition that women or other ethnicities or races might react differently to drugs or treatments. This was a bias of primarily male researchers and led to the mistreatment of women and minorities. In our next video, we are going to see a short animated video on what peer review means. Most of the research you should use will be peer-reviewed. Some databases use the term refereed, and that means the same thing as peer-reviewed. I'll also note that some respected journals are not peer-reviewed, but articles are reviewed by an editorial board. This is not as good a review as a peer review, but is better than a magazine article.